Hey everybody, it's Jonathan. Happy Wednesday. Sorry I'm a little late. Coming off my other Facebook Live. We got kind of heated tonight. It's got kind of excited. So I hope you're here. Hope you enjoyed watching the Olympics. And well, I don't know. How'd you feel about the Olympics? I was kind of weirded out by it in some things. I was kind of disappointed in some things. I think from an American who lives in Canada, the difference between the coverage is very different in terms of what you see in terms of sports and things like that. And I think the American coverage kind of gets me tired and fatigued, to be honest. And as a fan of sports, and I find sometimes I'm turning them off because I'm no longer a fan of sports, and that's kind of weird. So, the I just want to welcome everybody tonight. So we do these every Wednesday night, 7:15 roughly Mountain Time, 9:15 Eastern. If this is the first time you're hearing me, I'm Jonathan Edwards, Olympian Jonathan Edwards. I run athletespecific.com. I'm the creator of Mental Performance School, which I created as a way. We heard a lot about this Olympics, about mental health and things like that. I created a mental performance school a while ago to help athletes and parents understand kind of the demands and the expectations and really what to do to navigate this whole high performance athlete thing. And I've been working with athletes now for a very long time. And I've got a lot of fantastic coaches who I keep in touch with who also work with athletes. And so, so the times, even though the times are changing, we're going to talk about this tonight, the fundamentals of performance are the same and they never change. And so there's a lot of talk about like the new generation of athletes and how they're different from past athletes. And really that's not true. The bottom line is the athletes can change, but the principles of performance success will always be the same. Okay. Regardless of what the media wants to tell you, regardless of people in the mental health world want to tell you. I thought it was kind of interesting during the Olympics, like people got all over the critics of Simone Biles. And I was probably thrown into that category, but actually wasn't criticizing her. What I was criticizing was the media's portrayal of this idea that that somehow that the standards of performance are different, and they're not, because the harshest critic for an athlete is the scoreboard or the finish line or the judge. So that's what I focus on here, is helping our athletes succeed regardless of what they're going through, regardless of their environment, to make shit happen. Pardon me, but that's the deal. So if this is your first time hearing me, I'm Jonathan. I wrote a book. I wrote a book called An Athlete's Guide to Winning in Sports and Life, which is on Amazon. I hope you'll grab a copy. You can grab the Kindle version, grab a print version, whatever, and check it out. But I'm really proud of that book. We hit number 2 in sports psychology when it launched, and marketing a book is hard. So I'm pretty happy with how it's gone. So I hope you'll invest in that for your athlete minimally. That'd be really cool. All right. So, but I work with athletes in a variety of sports now, which is kind of cool. So I was a high school American in the sport of lacrosse. I was a Division I recruit in lacrosse. I was a goalie. I was also an Olympian in the sport of luge, which is kind of random, and I'm also the only child to 2 musicians, which makes all sorts of sense. So, so odds are your athlete has more going for them than I ever did. But together we'll kind of figure this out. So every week I answer questions from parents and families, kind of who have athletes who are trying to reach, whatever it is for their sport. Maybe they want to be a World Cup equestrian, or they want to play golf professionally, or they want to be a hockey player, or they want to go to the Olympics, or they want to play their sport in Division I in college, whatever. Or maybe they're just moving from the JV to the varsity. We do that too. So every week we're talking about this. So I got a podcast and this video and wherever you're seeing me. So do me a favor, whenever you see this, if you could drop a like, that's kind of great for the algorithm. It kind of spreads the word about this. And because this is truly like a labor of love for me. So let's get started today, shall we? The first category today that we're going to talk about is how you can't train for prodigy. Okay. So what I mean by that is that, oftentimes parents will, when I talk to a parent, they'll talk about some sort of athlete as an example who is a prodigy, who came up at a young age. They were very gifted. They were, some might call it blessed some God-given talents, like whatever your background is, they will they'll migrate to that. So like in a sport like hockey, you've got like Sidney Crosby, Connor McDavid. There's Austin Matthews. In sports like soccer, you'll have, especially on the girls' side, you hear a lot about girls come up at very young ages. There's a girl out of Oregon. Her name's going to escape me right now, but she's a very prodigious athlete, a soccer player, like 14. Had to like sue to get her to play in the MLS, or the women's professional version, things like that. So people always migrate to those as examples, and I wanted to talk about that because what ends up happening is I don't believe you can train for prodigy. Okay, so as athletes or as adults, we know that when we get into comparison mode all the time, it can really drain our psyche. Okay, it can really kind of wear us down. However, athletically, you're constantly in comparison mode all the time. And even if you're not in comparison mode on the field of play, invariably there's going to be some sort of like physical testing standard that you have to do, or there'll be some sort of combine or that you're supposed to participate in that is going to score you against other athletes. So when I was on the Olympic team or trying to become an Olympian, every quarter or so we did physical testing, right? And our strength conditioning coach was part of that. Jeff Shire, who listens to this occasionally, was part of that. Steve Mayorka. This a couple of years ago, I was working with Tennis Canada on a weekend event with some of the best tennis players in Alberta, and they had a sports science guy out there testing these athletes. Why? Well, sports science is really there to help put athletes into nice, tidy little boxes. Okay. Why? Because funding, especially for Olympic level sports, funding is tied to athlete success. And then what is also done is they're trying to predict athlete success, right? So I remember years and years ago when the Berlin Wall came down, the information about the research that went behind the East German sports system and the Russian, like basically the communist sports system came out. And there was all this testing that went on. And a very famous story was that the Australian Rowing Federation took the research that was made public from the East German sporting system. So the East German rowers were fantastic. And what they learned was like that the East German rowers were like, they had data on like, okay, to be a successful rower internationally, you had to be so tall, your femurs had to be so long, the width of your shoulders was so wide, in your development, like other, they had all sorts of things to monitor. And kind of like if you've ever been in a company that has a sales organization, and what do? They take their top sales guy and they try to find like their personality profile, and they try to only hire people with that personality profile to be that, in the hopes that they'll be that same type of sales success, right? So it's just profiling. And programs like to do that. And so, but what ends up happening as an athlete is you do that and you're constantly reminded how either you're inside those boxes or you're outside those boxes. And if you're outside those boxes, now you have this pressure of like, well, athletes, your size, your height, your weight, don't typically make it. So what does that mean? Like, we should just stop, right? Because then there's always a story about the person that didn't fall into that nice little tidy box who made it. They were too tall, too short, too fat, too thin, too twitchy, too slow, but they still survived. Not only did they survive, but they made it. And so that always fascinates me because prodigies often don't fit into those nice, tidy boxes. But what are you going to do if you're outside that box? Other than just try to get yourself inside the box. So for luge, for example, like we had physical testing, and we had how many push-ups we could do in 30 seconds. We had how many pull-ups you could do in 10 seconds. We had we ran the 40-yard dash, we ran the mile, all sorts of things. Like, so the idea was that somehow if you did these things well outside of your sport, that you would then be good inside your sport. You have a fast start, you have good runs, things like that. And that doesn't always work out for luge. Like that didn't always work out because we had we had athletes like Wendell Suko, like who was a big dude, right? And he ended up being world champion on the Calgary track in like 1991, I think it was. But what was cool about that race in particular was that he won, and he was a big dude, probably 6 foot, probably I don't know, pushing the north side of 250 up. The second place guy was Georg Hackl, who was kind of my build, 5'9". I'm a little smaller than that, but he was like, probably $185, $190. And then I can't remember who finished third. But then also like in the Olympics in luge, way back in like 1994, for example, Georg Hackl was, again, kind of built like a fire hydrant, beat Marcus Prock, who looked more like a tall like executive, and then Armin Zogler, who was like a young dude and smaller and skinnier and whatever. But it just showed that like kind of those 3 different body types could have success. Now you look at tennis. Tennis is a sport that I like to use as an example because there's a lot of money in tennis, right? There's tons of money in tennis and tons of research, tons of people buying equipment and shoes and rackets and balls. And there's just lots of marketability around the athletes in that sport. So there's also a lot of money to go to the science that then trickles down into athlete development. And so tennis is one of those sports. Well, you'll have some kid pop up out of somewhere, some country at a young age, and they're also really, really good. A lot of times it happens on the girls' side. But then what if you have a girl on the other side and you're still trying to compete? Do you just give up? Do you just realize like, oh, wow, she's ranked like number 10 in the world and she's 15 or 16 and I'm, 14 and I'm nowhere close. Like, should I just give up now? That's the demand it throws in your athlete. That's kind of the mental gymnastics it throws in your athlete. And that kind of sucks. Okay. So the thing about it too, especially in this day and age of social media, is that young, prodigious athletes, regardless of the sport. I think of Sky Brown in skateboarding, who took like, she was like the youngest Olympian for the UK or the youngest medalist. She medaled at like 13, whatever it was. But if you're a skateboarder and you're not 13, what do you do? And it's kind of fascinating because in skateboarding at the Olympics, there was athletes who were like 13 and then there was athletes who were like 30 and they're still going, right? So you can't train to be prodigious, but all you can do is still apply you're developing your physical ability, your technical ability, and your tactical ability, regardless of your sport. Okay. It's really important to understand physical, technical, tactical, regardless of your sport. If you stay focused on that and you stay out of comparison mode as much as possible, then what ends up happening is you end up ensuring a bit of longevity. Right. So the thing that's going to run out is one of your resources, time, energy, or money. What people don't take into consideration, though, is even when there's like a prodigious athlete who's young, is they assume that everybody is moving up the ladder at the same pace. So while one athlete over here may jump ahead and be quite prodigious, there's another athlete over here who, by taking a bit of the long game and they can stick it out for the long haul, they end up having success long term. So in my own athletic experience, one of the things that I saw and I lived was that sometimes you have an athlete who's like maybe not prodigious, but they're an early developer, right? Like they're good. What ends up happening is that those athletes, it's kind of like they've been helicoptered to the top of the mountain. Right. So imagine you're climbing up a mountain and you and this other like person you're competing against, you're hiking up at the same pace, right? Maybe they're a little bit further ahead. And so you're kind of bummed out because they're ahead and you're doing your best, but you're walking up the same path. Right? Now, their development helicopters them to the top of the mountain, but you're still hiking, right? And you're going up the trail and you're climbing over rocks and you're walking around trees and you're walking through rivers and things like that. Meanwhile, they didn't have to do any of that, or so it seems. They got helicoptered to the top and now they're on the top and everybody's looking at them. And in this day and age of social media likes to, watch the people who are at the top, right? The people who have the most eyeballs, even if they're not that good. Like with all this NIL stuff going on, name, image, and likeness stuff happening in the NCAA, there's kids now in high school who have like ridiculously large Instagram accounts who are not the best athletes, but they have this large Instagram account and they're signing deals. Why? Not on their athletic ability, but on their ability to capture eyeballs. Why? Because they're now there. So they took that work, but that's not the athletic work. It's their social media work, right? Different game. So now imagine like what happens if a storm comes. Okay. So storm comes, you're trudging through the snow and the rain and the sleet and you're getting up the mountain. And then what happens is the storm comes and that storm knocks that other person down from the top. What I've seen happen over and over again is the athlete who just trudges, like keeps going up that trail, keeps climbing, keeps working, keeps making it. They end up now in a situation where they know the path, right? They've labored, they know the path. And what happens is that path is now given them like predictability for the next bit of the path, right? To get up to the top of the mountain. Whereas that athlete who was a bit of a prodigy and then who got kind of helicoptered to the top, if they get knocked off because of that storm, one of the things that they don't have is a bit of a commitment to the sport. Like they don't know necessarily how they got there other than being really, really good. Now, I've seen this happen over and over again where sometimes those athletes become coaches and they're horrific coaches. Like I relate them to like my math teacher in high school who was like a Harvard master's grad, magna cum, like whatever. And he couldn't get it while we didn't understand math, right? And so that happens to these athletes. They get knocked down and they don't understand really what got them to the top to begin with. So now there's a factor thrown in there where they now have to kind of trudge through and they now have to work at a level that they aren't accustomed to working at. Whereas your athlete may be like, they have that tolerance. They've built up that skill, and that skill is the skill of sticking to something and working and just kind of persevering. Where that prodigious athlete doesn't, they lack that. So sometimes an athlete who is a prodigy at a young age burns out, flares out, like they just don't understand. And they might be gifted with a skill, but they're not necessarily gifted with that mentality to persevere. Okay. So when a parent, comes to me like, oh yeah, my athlete's not, going to be Sidney Crosby. I'm like, thank God. Right. Or my athlete's not going to be Tom Brady. I'm like, well, wait a second. There's certain things, the things that you can do now, like regardless of your skill, like regardless of your output, you can still do things like, have these, and we're going to talk about these in the next segment today, but the kind of performance principles that are timeless, right? And these are things that if your athlete just kind of is able to put in the time, right, and is able to kind of keep going, they most likely will make it in the long term, but they may not make it in the short term. And that can suck a lot because it might mean you miss out on a team and now you got to do things on your own. Or it might mean that you've got to move to train with a new coach, or it might mean that you've got to raise money, or any number of things. But I believe that long term, and every coach will say this, that oh wait, good comment coming. There you go. Jeffy beat me to it. I'll take an athlete with consistent, prodigious effort versus prodigy any day. And that's true. Every coach will say that, right? Like, Jeff, you agree with this. Like, every coach will say that. But we all know that kind of, at the time, depending on the pressures that the coaches are feeling or the program is feeling, they need a result, right? So they're going to lean towards the result-driven athlete in the short term, even though every coach will say they want that prodigious, they want that consistently prodigious effort long term, right? So sometimes programs can't wait that long. So if a coach can, if an athlete can stick through it, then they might get that opportunity later. Because what I've seen happen a lot is I've seen athletes have to quit a sport for whatever reason because they lack the resources to stay, time, energy, money. while in the short term, a program takes a more prodigious, an athlete who's going to get results, and then that athlete may burn out. And the ROI there is kind of interesting, right? Because the program invests money into the athlete, and then that athlete that prodigious athlete may leave and then not be a coach, right? So you don't have that recycling of value of information back into a program. And it doesn't matter what the program is. It could be luge, it could be bobsled, it could be figure skating, it could be lacrosse, it could be football, whatever. So you don't have that. And so when parents can't, wish their athlete was prodigious, I think every coach will say, like, listen, if you can stick it out, right? If you can just kind of, you're on path. The path may not be as fast. You may not be ticking all the boxes right now, but if you can stick through it, then you have the chance to succeed long term. Now, one thing that I think that I was not really aware of when I was a young athlete, and I only learned this kind of later in my life when I became a business owner in a completely separate business of sports, but it was this idea that as we all say this about athletes, right? They're learning the skills and the mindset to be successful in life after sport. But then how can we see a lot of athletes who burn out, flare out, or commit suicide or things along those lines? And I think one of the mistakes that we make with sports, well, that's true. Like, it's true to a point. The positioning of the timing and the understanding of that message, in my opinion, is wrong. A lot of athletes are in a sport, and then once they have to stop in their sport, whatever that sport may be, that's when they say, like, hey, you're gonna, it's good. You've got all the skills to be successful in anything you want to do in life. However, athletes don't understand and their parents don't understand that message needs to come in the front end. It's like, okay, we are going to pursue this athletic path because along the way, we're going to learn how to be, to set a goal and really go after something and then put the resources we have towards it to make that happen, right? That needs to come in the front end, because what ends up happening when sport is over is, and this happens a lot with prodigious athletes, it's kind of like, child actors, right? All of a sudden they may retire. If they've had a very successful career, they retire, they get a lot of money, but now they're no longer getting kind of that neurochemical reward that they got from sport. And now they're trying to get it from something else. And that doesn't provide nearly the same amount, right? And so that's really interesting, okay? So what I want for my families to understand, and my coaches who listen to this, is that, your athletes across the board, regardless of their skill level, have resources, time, energy, money to put towards these things, okay? So, but it's different for everybody. So while the message you may give them both is like, hey, stick with it, it's all going to come out, you got to realize that the weight that's on both those athletes is very different. Okay, it's very different, and I think it's unfair for coaches to just demand that, to expect that it's the same. They don't realize what's going on in the background, right? And so that's important. The other thing that I think needs to happen is the message goes, all right, listen, guys, and because a lot of sport coaches don't understand this, right? They were in a sport, they mastered their sport, and now they're coaching that sport. And if they're still coaching, hey, that's awesome, right? Like, they have the talent to also now be a coach and get results out of other athletes. Awesome. All right, cool. However, that coach doesn't necessarily fully understand the message that could go to an athlete to help them succeed through sport and then into life. Okay. And that's not the coach's fault. It's just the way the environment is. Right. So a lot of people look at coaches like, oh, they use their athletes or something. No. They didn't use their athletes. They used their athletes for the skill that everybody was signed up for at the time. Right. It's like, hey, we're going to the Olympics. Right. We need athletes who want to go to the Olympics. We got coaches who want to help them go to the Olympics. This is what we're doing. Okay. Oh, now the athlete failed, like, and they're no longer competing. Oh, okay, that's fine. Like, but we want to get that athlete to get out of sport and then into life successfully. Right. And so the coach can't really do that message, but the parents can. It's like, listen, we're going to go after this Olympic thing, and we're going to put everything we can towards it, because that's the same approach that when you're done with sport, you're going to have to take towards finding a job or a career or something like that. The next thing in your life that gives you the same neurological rewards that you had before. And this is, again, why a lot of athletes really fail in life after sport, is because they lack they lack that neurochemical reward, and then they may turn to alcohol or drugs to get that same response. But even then, it's not the same, and then you have like horrific stories. We don't want that, all right? So the idea that your athlete is not a prodigy is actually, I think, a lot of coaches, like Jeff, you said it, a lot of coaches' minds, it's a good thing, but programs and coaches need athlete who gets results, right? They have to get results. And I lived that with the Canadian Olympic Committee when they were doing Own the Podium for the Vancouver Olympics in 2010. It was like, hey, listen, guys, like we need athletes, who are going to make it. We're going to put money towards them. And then who do you think that's going to be? Well, what are you going to say? Well, this athlete is getting results now, but we don't think they're going to last long term. We've got this other athlete over here who's a long-term development, but they're like, no, I can't do that right now. So you got to be prepared for that as a family to survive that moment. Okay. So even though your athlete isn't a prodigy, you can't train for prodigy. So don't worry about it. Don't put yourself in comparison mode as much as possible, and work on your game and your plan moving ahead. All right. So let's keep that going. All right. So if you later, if you listen to me on Apple Podcasts or whatever, you want to send me a Coach Edwards at athletespecific.com. You can send me a note, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, your questions, and all that stuff. So we're gonna move to the second question for tonight. All right. So second question for tonight is, and this is really kind of coming after the Olympics and my article I posted on LinkedIn about Simone Biles and kind of what I think was really going on there. It's not just as simple as like the twisties or whatever. One of the conversations that didn't come out with the Simone Biles thing is, if I'm USA Gymnastics or if I'm her coach, I'm pissed that we didn't prepare for this, right? And so when she bowed out of the Olympics and people were like, hey, and the people got all upset at the people who were like kind of being critical of it. The story that the media is not going to cover is this idea, like, okay, where did whoever is in her orbit, like her agent, her sports psychologist, like, the people around her, no one's talking about like that failure. Okay. So now, but one of the things I want to talk about tonight is in this idea of like performance principles. So, people were like going like, oh, it's a new generation of athletes and it's different now. And it's not. Like people were being critical of people who were being critical of Simone Biles or Naomi Osaka. And they're like, oh, she's so brave. Okay, wait a second. That's great. That's great. Celebrating bravery is great. Celebrating courage is good. However, for this particular task, okay, succeeding at the Olympics in Tokyo 2020, that didn't go very well, right? So she couldn't do that for whatever reason, okay, for whatever reason. And the idea there is not that it's like, oh, you're not a Black woman in America in 2020 trying to, like, it's not about that. You can't try to just narrow it down to something that's like because the principles around it are the same, regardless of what someone's going through, right? So like, I said this on a podcast last week, like the idea of, okay, when people were critical of the people who are being critical. And the hilarious thing about it is the most critical thing, the most critical judge of any athlete is the finish line, right? So like I grew up, I competed in an Olympic event, a timed Olympic event. So it doesn't matter if it's luge or bobsled or biathlon or track and field, right? Or cycling. Everybody comes to the line with their own shit, right? I can't think of a different word to say, right? Everybody's got their own baggage. Oh, you're a Black woman in America, and you dealt with like sexual abuse. Okay, that's your thing. Athlete over here, you're a mom, okay, and you lost a relative to COVID, okay, and then you over there, like, okay, you're from a war-torn country. and you over here, like your National Olympic Committee has no money, so you've basically funded this entire thing on your own. Okay, so the question is, how do you weight all that? You can't, right? We don't handicap athletes at the line. We just say, all right, here you go. Oh, you can't afford a high-tech speed suit? All right, that's okay. Go ahead. You're gonna, oh, you can't afford like a carbon fiber bike or a fully custom one? Okay, we don't care. The sport doesn't care. The finish line doesn't care, because when the medals are given out, there's no asterisk that says, oh, you went through this, then you get a half point or a half second or whatever. It doesn't do that. But the principles around the performance, around successful performance, are the same. Okay. Now, a cool book for this, and I was trying to find on my shelf, and I can never find books on my shelf easily, which is unfortunate. But if you want a cool little background, one, go get my book, An Athlete's Guide to Winning in Sports and Life. Okay, go get that book, right? Shameless plug. But also another book that's really helpful is a book called The Success Principles by Jack Canfield. Okay, now there's tons of books, right? There's tons of books about success and principles of success and things like that. And all you need to do is read one good one, right? So if you don't read mine, go get The Success Principles by Jack Canfield, because there's like a bazillion, there's like 64, whatever, principles in that book. And the first one is about 100% responsibility. Okay. So as athletes, we go to the line, okay, or we go to the floor and we're getting judged, or we're jumping off a ski jump and we're getting judged and we get distance, like whatever. The idea is, if you're a swimmer in the pool, if you're a runner on the track, is that you're trying to get to that finish line faster than anybody else that day, regardless of what's going on in your life or what's going on in your environment at the moment, right? So rain, sleet, snow, hot. Like, I loved, it just drove me crazy during the Olympics. Like, the commentator is commenting on how hot it is at the track and field events. Yet there was another world record. There was an Olympic record. Oh, there was a personal best. There was a national best. Like, it just was endless. And so literally, while the guy's saying how hot and humid it is, they're setting records. So who gives a, you know what, right? Well, in North America, the general population in middle America, they're like, oh my God, it's so hot, I can never do that. I can barely go outside when it's like 72 degrees. Is there AC in this place? Oh my God, there's no AC. I am just sweating my what's off, right? Nobody cares. Nobody cares. When an athlete can take 100% responsibility for everything, then they can find a solution for everything. So E plus R equals O. It's another principle, like the event plus your response to your event equals your outcome. Okay. E plus R equals O. So while one athlete, it's hot, and one athlete said, all right, let's have a race in 34 degrees Celsius weather, right? 90 degrees Fahrenheit, whatever that is. Like, we're going to race today, 5,000 meters. Okay. Elite athletes will say, all right, let's do it. All right, it's going to be hot, but I just got to be ready for that, right? I may wear different clothes. I may hydrate extra. I'm going to get some more electrolytes in me, whatever. The idea is that you have a choice. Okay. All right. So you have a choice to come to the line and compete. Either that, or you don't. You quit. You walk away. So you're either going to have a good result and take responsibility, have a good result, or you are going to step away. You decide not to do it. But the truth is that performance principles around anything are timeless. Like, if you have a business and you have a product, but you have nobody to sell that product to, you don't have a business. Whereas somebody else who creates a product around a market, like around an audience, like, there's a very famous story. It's like, okay, if you're going to have a hot dog stand, like, let's say I'm going to give you a hot dog stand and we're going to sell the most hot dogs. What's the number one thing you're going to want to have a successful hot dog stand? And, some people may say like, oh, I need a big awning. We've got to have a certain brand of hot dog. We got to have a certain temperature of water. Like, I got to have maybe some sodas to sell. And all of that doesn't matter. What matters is you want to have a hungry audience who likes hot dogs, right? That's going to be the key to your success, right? So as athletes, what ends up happening is that athletes will, if they start to bitch and moan, complain about the weather or the venue or what's going on, they've lost before they even started. So kind of bringing this back to kind of the whole Simone Biles thing that happened recently, what really frustrated me was this idea of like, nobody was going to talk about, as an athlete, as a young athlete, you don't always think about these things. There's only a handful of athletes that really think, and hopefully more will think about this now, but they get ahead of the game. So like Novak Djokovic at the beginning of the Olympics talked about how hot it was. He also talked about how pressure was a privilege, which is a Billie Jean King buck from ages ago. But the idea was like he lost, I think, in the quarterfinals. Was the bronze medal match? Can't remember. But somebody still won the gold medal, right? Somebody still dealt with the heat. Somebody still made it through their opponents. How? Why? Because they took 100% responsibility and figured out like how to do that, how to succeed in the moment. That's all your athlete can do. So the U.S. Olympic Committee, while we can say like the U.S. Olympic Committee failed Simone Biles, the U.S. Gymnastics failed Simone Biles, her coaches, her inner orbit failed her, her agent especially probably failed her. But she as an athlete still has to take responsibility and go, what could I have done better to succeed in that moment? If in fact that's what she was doing, because I don't believe that they're fully going after the gold medal in this Olympics. I just don't. But the idea is that the principles around performance are timeless. So whether your athlete is like Gen X, Gen Z, Gen Y, a millennial, whatever, doesn't matter. If they're an activist athlete or they don't care, whatever. If they're tall, short, fat, thin, whatever, you've got to come to the line, and then you're going to compete on that day, and then you're going to get a result that day. And if your preparation prepares you for that day, then hopefully then you'll be the one that comes out on top. But when people who aren't particularly athletic throw in these ideas like, oh well, but she had all this pressure on her, the finish line doesn't matter. The judges don't. It doesn't care. They don't care. The finish line doesn't care. So, and that can seem really harsh, but the thing that's harsh is the harshest thing is the score. It's the finish line. It's the clock, right? It's the score on the scoreboard. That's the harshest critic you can have. And people got to remember that the principles to succeed are going to be the same forever, right? They're going to be the same forever, regardless, okay, of what's going on. And so I want you to focus on that. So what happens, some of my parents, I was doing a coaching call just this last week with one of my parents of an athlete who has Olympic hopes and dreams. And they're like, they're talking about things about, that fall into like kind of the political side of thing. Like, oh, this coach likes that athlete. Well, I'm like, hey, whatever. Doesn't matter. How are you going to work around that? What are you going to do? Right. We're going to talk about that a little bit in the last segment today. But the idea is that sometimes parents will talk, they will not know really good performance principles. Right. They may think they do, but when it comes down to it, they think that, oh, it's too much work, or I don't want my athlete to burn out, or this or that or the other thing. Doesn't matter. Like either you are going to go with those performance principles or not. And, it's if you have to quit, and by quit, I mean step away and not have the result that somebody else will have that day, then that's your choice. Right? And so that's that. I know people go like, oh, that's so harsh, but I'm like, nope. The harshest thing out there is the scoreboard. It's the finish clock. It's, the harshest critic out there is Omega, which runs all the timing at the Olympics. That's the harshest critic. Nothing harsher than that. All right. So keep that in mind. All right. So I got this weird comment in here that I'm trying to get rid of. Thanks, but no thanks. NY freak, beat it. All right. So this is an interesting one. as you guys know, like I run mentalperformanceschool.com, and if you have an athlete and you're a family and you're invested in wanting your athlete, I hope you'll invest in that. I've tried to make it one of the best resources out there. And I'm always adding to it too. So I want, if you've got an athlete who's got big athletic dreams, I want you to check out Mental Performance School and invest in that. And I hope to really kind of help your athlete, because there's no other program on the planet that works like an athlete and a family, that works with their athlete and the family. Right? So most people, like most parents, will send their athlete to a sports psychologist or a mental performance coach, whatever you want to call it, when their athlete's plateaued. Their athlete hasn't plateaued. They're frustrated because they're not getting results. So there's the plateau is superficial in my opinion, but the frustration is real. Okay, so one of the questions that comes up with a lot of my athletes is that should they relocate and work with another coach? Now, in some sports, that's not possible, right? So like in a sport like luge that I was part of, like you can't, there's not another coach. Sometimes within a program, there might be two coaches and you might like one versus the other. And that's okay. That's okay. But in sports like, tennis or gymnastics, or equestrian, you can just like up and leave and go to another country if you want to train. And so some people hear that and they're like, oh my God, who would make that investment? Well, people who are serious about being really good athletes. They do it all the time. And sometimes they do it for the right reasons, but sometimes they also do it, they get distracted and they do it for the wrong reasons. And so, I work with a lot of people in the tennis business, and this is very common. So a young figure skating is also another sport where this is common. So an athlete, starts competing and or starts in their sport, and their local coach helps get them to a certain point. And what I tell my athletes is that your coach is there to help you get to the next level. Okay, whatever that level is for you, by the way. Like it could, that doesn't always mean like, okay, you're going to be an Olympian. It just might mean like you're going from the JV to the varsity, or the junior national team to the senior national team, or the A team to the B team, the C team, like whatever. Okay. In equestrian, just as a fun little side note, there's an event called eventing. It's basically like cross country for a horse and rider. And the eventing events used to be incredibly long. They actually had to shorten them for the Olympics because of just like real estate. But in eventing, you can have a young rider who's like a really good rider, but they get a slow time because their horse is small or not very strong. So what do? They invest in a bigger horse. And then now you get an athlete on a bigger horse. And now with a bigger horse, you get bigger problems. Right. And in eventing, there's this thing called spiraling, where a horse like jumps over an obstacle, but gets hung up and basically does like a handstand. The horse does like a handstand and falls over and crushes the rider. And so every year people die in that sport because of, basically people going like, all right, if we just have a bigger, faster horse, we're going to win. Okay. And that same attitude trickles over into coaches, where people think like, oh, if I just had a different coach, I would be better. Sometimes your local coach is really good, and for whatever reason, they are not in the path from a business perspective to be that go-to flashy coach. Okay. And so I know a lot of coaches who fall in this category. Their mentality doesn't suit the program that has both players and payers. So for like a gymnastics facility, for instance, that has a competitive program, within that competitive program, there's going to be a handful of athletes that are really good, and they're going to make it to the next level. And then that program will have everybody else. And even at the bottom of that pile of athletes, there'll be athletes that shouldn't be there, where the coaching is not for them, but they're there and they're paying, and that's keeping the lights on, it's keeping the coaches paid, things along those lines. So rightly or wrongly, what ends up happening is parents will start to they'll look and they'll see a club that has more kids that are more competitive. That doesn't necessarily mean that coach is better, because the coach you may have is fantastic, but for whatever reasons, they are staying small. And that's something to kind of understand. And that's a conversation. It's a tough conversation, but you can actually have it with your coach and go, listen, because I encourage all my athletes to have a relationship with their coaching staff, right? Like not like a love relationship, but to like get to know your coach. And this is where sometimes parents miss the boat here, because parents who are in like a professional world, if they are like lawyers or if they're engineers and they're moving up and they're successful, there's a level of disagreeableness that helps them get there. Your coach may be technically very good and they can teach technical, they can teach tactical, they can teach physical, but personality wise, they may skew more on the agreeable side of things. And that may not be attractive to the parents because they want somebody who's going to be a little bit more of a hard ass on their kid. But your coach, even though they can tell your kid all the things they need to be an Olympian, you may not like that. Or vice versa. That coach may be a bit of a hard ass. And the parents may not be as much of a hard ass. So they skew more on the agreeable side. The coach is more on the disagreeable side of the spectrum. The athlete in the middle, though, needs to learn that disagreeable side to be successful in their sport, yet that rubs the athlete the wrong way because mom and dad aren't like that, right? So this happens all the time. The coach comes off as considered like a hard ass or abusive or things along those lines, when in fact, all they are is they're just on the disagreeable side of the spectrum. And for the parent or the athlete who's on the agreeable side of the spectrum, that rubs them really, really the wrong way. Okay. Now that's great. It works. It may work to a point while that athlete has success, but when that athlete starts not having success, okay, then that divide on the agreeableness spectrum it gets wider and causes more conflict. And that's weird and it's not cool. So one of the things that happens is that this may force a family to look for another coach. So that can go both ways. A coach can be looking for a more disagreeable coach that's going to push their athlete, right, and ask them to do more, be more, have more, and then put the athlete in an environment where there's better athletes that have a higher level of interest. I saw this with my own kids when they were young. Their personality was such that their personality meshed with the kids that were up a tier, like the tier 1, 2 kids. My kids like got along with them, but my kids didn't have the technical ability like those kids had, right? So what ends up happening? Well, your kid ends up being put with a lower tier, but the population of kids is wrong for them, right? So the mentality of those tier 4 or 5 kids is they're a bit of a goofball, right? And this is where sometimes when you put kids together of like mind and not like skill, you have more success. And I think what ends up happening in a lot of sports like soccer and, football and things along those lines is you're going to have kids that may not be up to speed technically yet, but their mentality is that of a world-class athlete. And so what we miss is that we miss that disconnect. So let's say you have an athlete who is very agreeable and very talented, but now you put them into a program with kids who are like really competitive and as talented. Well, now your athlete has to start learning the skills to manage that environment. Okay. The coaches, just to give you a little background here, the smaller the sport, usually the more sense of politicalness there is. I had a strength and conditioning coach, Charles Staley, taught me that. He worked with athletes who were in USA weightlifting. Okay. And weightlifting in the United States, especially 15 years ago, was just tiny. It's gotten better with CrossFit. There's actually been more kids, more athletes. And so it's really kind of drawn that. But you take an athlete who is like agreeable and conscientious and throw them in a situation where they have to be like pretty disagreeable and really stick up for themselves. They don't have that skill, right? And that skill is not necessarily a athletic skill. It's a negotiating life skill. And I didn't learn that until way late in my life, right? So, but nobody ever talks about this. So you may have a very good coach locally, and maybe that coach is a hard ass on your athlete. And you're looking at this other program, this other club, and you're going like, oh, I've heard really good things about that coach. But that coach may be building a business, right? They're building a business of athletes. And so then they have to take on a different attitude, a different approach with your athlete. They've got to be more like, oh, hey, Mrs. Jones, yo, yes, we'd love to have your athlete. Oh, they'd be a fantastic fit. They don't give a shit. They really don't, right? They that coach may be equally talented, or maybe less talented than the coach that you have, but the parents aren't willing to stick with that coach because of a personality difference that not only is the athlete uncomfortable with, but the parents are uncomfortable with. Okay. And right now we're in this total world of hyper focus on being offended and hypersensitivity, and really like it's and you can argue that all day long. You say like, oh no, coaches now are horrible and they're abusive, whatever. No. Coaches have probably been like that for a really long time. And I can attest for that in my own experience, but the idea is that as a family and as an athlete, you are navigating the personalities around your sport. So how do you do that? So as a family, mom, dad, athlete, maybe some brothers and sisters there, the idea is that we are developing an athlete who is physically, technically, and tactically capable to survive their sport, right, at the highest level, right? So physical, technical, tactical abilities, right? That comes first. And I have that at athletespecific.com. If you want to learn more about that, if you go check out athletespecific.com and just click on the link in the upper corner there and download. You can download. I've got a ton of free resources. Managing negative thoughts. If you click on that, you will. There's a ton of resources there. Okay, to check out. Okay, so automatic negative thoughts. There's also I've got resources on the 3 key abilities. So what are you trying to do? You're trying to prepare your athlete to survive in that environment. Now, this is a skill. If you go to the homepage at athletespecific.com and hit the get a free course button, you can get my athletic 3 key abilities. And I got one for athletes and I got one for parents. You can check that out there. Okay. See my smiling face. Hi. All right. So with that, the idea is that you have to decide who is going to help your athlete develop those abilities efficiently. All right. And so I didn't say fast. I didn't say quickly. I didn't say make them super strong or what. I just said like efficiently. Okay. So does your club, does your coach right now, the one you're with, have those resources? Right. Because one of the things that we talk about in sport a lot is volume. And so in luge, a sport like luge, it's run volume. In same thing goes with like racing cars or riding horses. Like it's just volume, right? Lifting weights, there's always a volume number. How much time, and in that time, how much load have you had? And so you can track all that, right? So can your current coach give you that training load? Okay, and in their opinion, are they on track? Like, is your athlete on track? Because sometimes a program may ask your athlete to play up. Okay, so they can play up a level. So let's say they're a young athlete, they're playing with older athletes, or and the coaching staff thinks that your athlete needs to be around that that demand. Okay, so I work with a lot of athletes in team sports, and so this happens a lot. So your athlete at a young age is above average for their age. So one of the best ways to do that, to improve that, is like we're going to take that younger athlete and put them around older athletes. Okay, to basically give them a better demand. So in soccer a lot, you have kids, they're called call-ups, right? So they're a tier 3 athlete and they get called up to play with a tier 1 team. So that's usually your best athlete off of that tier 3 team gets to go play up. Okay, you can have kids that are JV athletes, but they can go play with a varsity. Okay, in more kind of not esoteric, I don't know if that's the right word, but in other sports like gymnastics or whatnot, you might have a young athlete who gets asked to go train with the older team. So when I was on the junior national team in luge and was competing with Mark Romet, we raced in this is 1991. We raced in the World Championships in Winterberg, and we had a really good result. We finished 4th, and I remember Lynn Hancock that night said, "Hey, how would you guys like to go to Calgary for the World Championships with a senior national team?" And we were like, "Hell yeah, let's do it." And I mean, that was awesome, right? And it was good. And we were just in that mode of just, still competing. And it was more volume, right? We got a chance to go race and compete in an event that wasn't too far over our head. It was just going to be great experience. Okay. So there's a difference there if you understand that. So there's, in that experience, there was no additional physical load on us other than going to go spend some more time competing, like sliding, like, and taking runs in a big environment. And I still remember flying from Germany to Calgary, and the first thing we did when we arrived in Calgary, and we were so excited for this, was we got to have dinner at the hotel restaurant. Like, it was on the team. And I remember having a steak sandwich, and it was just like the best thing. It was awesome. I love steak sandwiches still, right? Because of that moment, like, it's just seared into my brain. But that event for us wasn't going to be any more load on us. Now, the one thing though, we were still high school kids. We had homework to do. We had things like that. So we just put all that aside to compete and just have that moment. It's different than like if we were like a rugby player or a football player, and you're like super good technically, and you get called up to all of a sudden now and you're going up against bigger, faster kids, and you might risk an injury. Okay. So you have to think about that load in terms of like, all right, am I going to go, like I see this happen with hockey kids all the time. They get called up to a new team, and they get, especially like in junior A hockey, there's like, or especially in lacrosse too, like there's a 5-year spread of athlete. There's a 17-year-old kid going up against a 21-year-old kid. That's a massive physical jump. So you have to weigh that risk in terms of is it good to go train with that new program and that new coach who's involved in that program. And so this is where I warn my parents, like, if you're in a sport where the coach is getting compensated, like, hockey, soccer, it's like a travel program or things along those lines, you've got to worry about the ulterior motives of the coach, right? But sometimes, even with that, being aware of that, the coach's motives may be completely pure, but they may look weird. So you have to decide that. If your athlete's personality, though, is seeking to be around more competitive people. Now, I notice I didn't say like better people, because I'll be honest, like, there's athletes who are completely prodigious. They are not prodigious, but they're fantastic athletes. They're really good performers, yet they're asshole. Like, they're just, I can't give it a different word. Or they have got drug problems or drinking problems, or, I'll be honest, like, although I won't even go there. But, especially for like my it's a big, I won't get into that conversation right now. If your athlete they have a more adult mentality for their age, okay? If they're psychologically more mature, moving up a level, being with a different coach, demanding more is a good choice. If your athlete, though, is a bit of a baby, and I say that respectfully, and some parents like think of their kids as like always a baby. Like, I've told this story before. I had a lacrosse player who was a Division I recruit. Like, this kid got a half scholarship to Division I school, and his mom was like, "How does anybody want to recruit my kid? He still doesn't pick up his laundry off the floor." That's your own deal. Like, you have to look at yourself and as a parent and go like, am I seeing my athlete like? Because this, like, I as a parent, your kid, but also sometimes as a parent, you don't want your kid to grow up. You don't want them to leave the house. You don't want them to have an experience that they really deserve, because as a mom or as a dad, you're still trying to hold them close, right? And so that's fine, but you just got to be aware, like, what am I doing here? Like I had a parent recently who I realized was, they didn't want their kid to get their driver's license because they didn't want them to drive away. And that's a stake in the heart moment, right? That's a pull on the heartstrings moment. But only as a parent, you know that. So if your athlete gets recruited, so to speak, like a coach from another program or another club, or like the varsity coach to the JV, or the senior team to the junior team, that the idea there is like, you've got to just ask really good questions of the coach and go like, okay, why are we doing this? Like, how does this serve my athlete in their long-term athlete development? And that's a legitimate question to ask your coach. Just say, okay, how does going to your team, your club, your program serve my athlete in their long-term athlete development? And one thing, just a little caveat here, if your athlete is like a division, if they're like a collegiate athlete in a team sport, some people treat that Division I program as the end. But I'm here to tell you that that's not true. So in sports like football, for example, that football player who's going D1, they're trying to get to the NFL. So the question is, coach, how does my athlete going to your program serve that goal? Okay. So for any of my athletes that are on Olympic tracks, like skiing, luge, skating, like whatever, the idea is like, okay, how is going to your program fit into that mode? And then you go to your current coach and you go like, okay, how do you feel? Like, so, I work with a lot of tennis kids, and tennis kids, they're notorious for wanting to train at some big facility with some big name coach, whereas that local coach they have he's actually a better coach. They're going to help them. And to be honest, that coach is desperate to help to develop your athlete and reap that reward for them. Like, as a coach, like, a lot of times coaches like lose athletes to other programs. And then the parents are like, oh my God, that's the same thing that other coach was telling us the whole time. And then your coach is probably home now without you as an athlete going like, yeah, I told you so. Now, do you go back to that coach? Well, maybe. But the thing is that, the ultimate question is like, how does this move fit into the development of my athlete? Is the competition appropriate? Because one thing that every athlete needs to have is like that Goldilocks theory of competition, right? You want to have some competition that's too hot, right? And you lose. You want to have competition that's too cold, where you just breeze through it. And then you want to have competition that's just right. And sometimes when you're the athlete at the top of the food chain in your program, most of what you're finding is that the competition is too cold. It's not pushing you enough. And it's a very special athlete that can develop all the habits. And I wrote about this in my book, but it's a rare athlete that can develop all of those habits and develop all those habits in a program that doesn't give them enough competition. Okay. So being around better athletes that have better results, but also looking beyond even those athletes, like, if you're in an international sport, you want to be looking at athletes who are the best in the world. Right. So like, I love watching swimming at the Olympics because it's kind of neat is you get all these athletes from all these different countries, right? They're all competing under their country, under their flag, but they all go to like, Stanford or, Texas Tech or like whatever. So they've seen each other collegiately. And what's kind of cool in a timed event is that you're looking at the time, like the best time in the world this year is this, and I'm here. And so that takes your eye off of the swimmer to your right or your left. Right. And so that's really cool. But in some sports, you don't really have that very easily. But you always want to be training for the athlete who's not with you all the time. Right. You don't want to be the cream of the crop. You don't want to be the top of the bottom of the barrel. You want to be a good athlete in a good program. And you may be an athlete in a program where, okay, so you win all the stuff in your club. You train locally, you win all the stuff locally, but then you go to like a national event. And that's where you get a chance to compete against that other athlete in a different part of the country, right? That kid from Florida, right? And you're from Oregon, right? And so now you're going to get a chance to compete, but you're going to go back home to your family and train with your coach and do whatever. But you may find you get to a point where you're like, okay, I've kind of plateaued. I'm not getting I've got bigger fish to fry here. Like, what do I do? So I want to wrap this up by saying sometimes the coach you currently have is the best option, depending on your sport, depending where you are, depending on the resources that you have. It's the best option. And you can do more with that coach, especially if you sit down with that coach and you get on the same page and you go, all right, what are we trying to do here? And how are we going to do it? Because when you have that understanding as a parent and as an athlete, that this is the plan, and that plan keeps reaping results, fantastic. You don't need to go anywhere. You don't have to seek out like the best facility, like the whiz bang facility that's got like the fresh towels and the good food and all that sort of stuff. You might not need that, but depending on your personality as a family, that may be a better choice. All right. What I've noticed, and there's no science behind this, but what I've noticed is that athletes and families who skew agreeable in the personality in the big five, they have difficulty with coaches who are disagreeable. But they will seek out a coach in a program who is more disagreeable to push their athlete. But then their athlete, because they're not necessarily that same mentality, that may not work very well for them. Coach may think they're not working hard enough. Athlete might think the coach is a jerk. Doesn't work out. Parents and athletes who skew more on the disagreeable side, who have a local coach who is more a nice guy, that nice guy who is agreeable may be technically the smartest thing in the book. You may have like a bookshelf like mine, just like all the technical parts of your sport, know everything. And then what ends up happening is that they don't like that local coach anymore. They don't think it's enough, even though he is like this. He might be a savant, right, in your sport. That's really important to kind of unaware. So then what ends up happening is that they seek other disagreeable coaches that are going to push their athlete and be a little bit more hard-nosed and make them work harder. So now you go to that coach, but now you got a program of athletes around that coach. And now that coach and that athlete, maybe they're away from home. They don't like anybody. They've got this like Olympic dream or this national dream. But they have no friends. And now it's like, we moved here for that coach, but now all the athletes, there's just not that personality mesh there. But again, like from an athlete perspective, that can only get you so far, right? You've got to make those, if an athlete is more introverted and they're happy by themselves, they might do okay, right? But if they're extroverted and they want to have friends and they want to, maybe there's some cute guy or some cute girl, like it's like, well, wait a second, there's all these other tensions around it. You got to weigh that too, right? Or if you're billeting, if your athlete's like leaving, we're home and they're billeting someplace and the billet's a bad deal, like you just got to think of all that stuff. Okay. So to wrap up, have conversations with your coach locally. What's the plan? What are we doing? How are we going to get there? All right. If there's this other bright and shiny object out there, it might be perfect. But the question is like, how does this fit into the long-term athlete development of my athlete? What are we going to get from this that we're not getting currently? What are we losing that we currently enjoy? Is that going to serve us? What's the overall personality of you as the coach? Those you got to add, and there's like a laundry list of questions, right? And you've got to ask those questions. Okay. So, all right. So listen, if you enjoyed today, do me a favor, hit the like button. Please leave a comment wherever you are. Please share this with an athlete that needs to hear it or your coach. When you're ready, come join Mental Performance School. I hope that you'll take. We're finally live and we're finally up and ready there, and I've made it as affordable as I can with the payment plans that I can, and I hope that you really kind of take if you've got an athlete who's serious about making this stuff work, and you want, as a family to go for it, then it's the best option I can give you, other than working with me personally. So, but yeah, I'm glad if you're watching me, if you're listening to me right now, thanks so much for listening. Reach out, send me a note, coachedwards@athletespecific.com. Just drop me a note and tell me like who you are, where you are, what you're listening to, or find me on Facebook. I'd love to know, even if we never work together, I just love to know whose ears these touch. And I look forward to seeing you guys next week. All right, guys, take care.